and professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our last research seminar for the semester in our series. We have the honor of inviting Professor Siqi Zheng from MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning here today, and she'll be talking about air pollution avoidance behaviors and neglected social costs. Before I get started and introduce Professor John Carruthers, who will be then introducing Professor Zheng, here's our beautiful poster that Alviano created. Let me begin with the land recognition and invite someone to help us give this recognition today. Can I have a volunteer who's willing to say it?
I can do it.
Okay, go ahead.
Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayogahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayogahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayogahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayogahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters.
Thanks so much, Mitch. Really appreciate that. All right, just as a reminder, this following Friday will be our last colloquium meeting where Professor Nima Kudva will be presenting solidarity stories that she's been gathering together with some of the MRP and other students, stories of solidarity during this time of COVID and how groups have come together. I think that'll be a wonderful way for us to end the semester. All right, today I'm grateful to the department for bringing Siqi to speak with us. I'm also thankful to Chris Hinman and Alviano Stenson for helping organize this particular event, and to Professor John Carruthers, who invited Siqi to give this talk. Professor John Carruthers in evaluating environmental remediation projects in the Puget Sound region of Washington State and the value of public education and other amenities in the Seoul metropolitan area. Before joining Cornell, Professor Carruthers worked at the George Washington University, where he was the founding director of the Sustainable Urban Planning Program, which he led to PAB accreditation. In 2016, he was recognized by the National Capital Area chapter of the American Planning Association via its Distinguished Leadership Award for Planning Educator. And then in 2019, he received George Washington Award, GW's highest academic honor. His research has been published in leading journals, including Environment and Planning B, the International Regional Science Review, Journal of Economic Geography, and Journal of Regional Science. He did his bachelor's at Hunter College in the City University of New York, did a master's in science from the University of Arizona, and got his PhD from the University of Washington in 2001. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carruthers to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Siqi. It's a real pleasure to have you. I wish we could have you in person, and I'm sure we will get an opportunity to do that sometime in the future. Just want to introduce Dr. Siqi Zheng. She is the Samuel Tak Lee Professor in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning and the Center for Real Estate, where she is a founder and faculty director of the Sustainable Urbanization Lab and its China Future Cities program. Siqi is an expert in urban and environmental economics with a focus on China and developing countries, including environmental sustainability, place-based policies, and self-sustaining urban growth. She's a co-author of, with Matthew Kahn, of the book Blue Skies Over Beijing, which, as pointed out before, students in my class are presently reading, which focuses on economic growth and the environment in China. She's published more than 100 research papers and 2 other books in Chinese. Siqi received her PhD in urban development and real estate from Tsinghua University in 2005. Did a postdoc in the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Prior to coming to MIT, she was a professor and director of the Hong Lung Center for Real Estate at Tsinghua University in China, where she still holds a distinguished visiting professor position. It seems they don't want to let go of her, which is always exciting. So thank you so much, Siqi, for joining us, and welcome to Cornell University via my living room. And thank you for joining us in these difficult times. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Zheng and Linda. It's my honor, my pleasure to be here to present my recent work. I'm gonna share my screen and also my co-author Yichun, who is a PhD student in the Urban Study and Planning Department at MIT, also here. And so basically she can also answer your questions. So basically if you have questions, you can just put in the chat box, and later after my talk, we will have a Q&A. So I'm gonna share my screen. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today the topic is about air pollution, avoidance behaviors, and the neglected social cost. So I incorporated 3 papers in this talk, and one already published, and the other 2 are working papers. So the working papers are this outdoor leisure activity and commuting behaviors. So we look forward to your comments to further improve our papers. So we have such a, so we try to have a framework. We try to have a framework so that it's not like scattered around 3 papers, but have this framework so that you understand. Just now I said to Linda that all the 3 papers are about China, but we hope this framework can also be applied to other countries. And if you are interested with, you have the data, you have the idea, we are very open to further collaboration along this line. So the motivation. So basically, as on air pollution with a special focus on China for many, many years, back to 2005 at that time. And because, as you know, China is a very good setting, although very bad for the people there, but it's a good setting to study the impacts of air pollution on all aspects. So we know that the air pollution in Chinese cities are very high, especially in the winter time now because of winter heating, coal-based winter heating. And also this is also a common problem for many developing countries like India, New Delhi, and other developing countries, very high air pollution. And all the public health literature, they already presented very astonishing fact that the air pollution will lead to 7 million deaths due to this related diseases like stroke and heart disease, lung cancer, etc. And in China, we also know that basically the pollution is so high that in very heavily polluted days, almost like smoke, 40 cigarettes a day, if like very polluted, like in Beijing from this map you can see. And so basically the pollution, air pollution is a typical negative externality, which means the producers, like the factories, like the car drivers, like the power plants, they produce the air pollution to the air, but they don't account for the external costs. So basically, they produce the pollutants to the air, but they don't bear the corresponding cost. It's externality, and others, like the common people, they will suffer from the air pollution. They will breathe very dirty air. So then because of the producers, they don't consider this cost, then they will oversupply the pollution. So basically, if we want to correct this externality, we need to add on some pollution tax or other ways to internalize this external cost into the producers' decision making and lift up the this cost function. Then that will reduce those producers' production of the pollution. So that's the basic idea of the social cost. Social cost means the producers of the pollution, they don't bear the cost. And however, from the other hand, so for the people, they are not passive victims. So they are not like just stay there and breathe the dirty air no matter what. So they also have ways to protect themselves. And it's very interesting to see the similarity here. And the very polluted days, because of air pollution, many Chinese people, they wear face masks. That's why they are used to wearing face masks, and why when the COVID came, so it's easier to enforce in China to ask people to wear face masks, because they already wear a lot because of the polluted air. And now in the US and in all the countries globally, we have the COVID problem. And some countries, people just really wear face masks, all the people, and very easily. But in some places, it's not that easy to convince people to wear face masks. But anyway, now because of such a severe problem of the COVID, and it's almost mandatory if you go out to wear face mask. So that's basically to show you that people, they have ways, even if the air is so dirty, even if the governments, they don't have very effective ways to regulate, to mitigate the pollution or now the COVID. But people, consumers, they can buy market products to protect themselves. Face mask is one example, and we have other examples like air purifiers that people can use indoors to clean up the air. So because of this self-protection or avoidance behavior, we have two implications at least. First, if you don't consider this self-protection, if you just assume very naively that, okay, people are victims. If the pollution is high, they just breathe the dirty air. Then if you calculate such a biological impact of air pollution, you will overestimate the negative impact. Because people can wear face masks, they can stay at home without going out, and then actually the real impact might, you might overestimate. On the other hand, people can do those avoidance behaviors. They can buy products and wear face masks to protect themselves, but they really that will incur some other welfare loss. It's beyond the health, and it's on all population groups. Because they wear face masks, they stay at home, so they won't get all the severe problems of the lung cancer and all the stroke and heart disease. So they won't go to hospital. So you will see not so many people just went to hospitalized because of the pollution, but they will have other costs. For example, they stayed at home, they couldn't go out to do all the social activities, and they feel depressed, and etc. And they lose all the opportunities. So that's basically another cost. So we might overestimate the direct cost, health cost from the pollution, but we might underestimate all these additional induced cost of those self-protection behaviors. So that's basically why we got so interested in this area, and we have done some research. So there's a huge literature on the impacts of air pollution. So we just listed here, and I won't go to the details, but these big categories. So first of all, how the pollution will influence health, mortality, and mobility. Many papers on this. And then how the pollution will negatively impact labor productivity and the cognitive performance, like students test score and their performance, and workers' productivity, both high-skilled and low-skilled, many papers on that. And also how air pollution will lower people's happiness and subjective well-being, several papers on this. So basically say, oh, it's polluted, then people become unhappy. So basically two ways of doing this third category research. One is based on survey because it's so subjective, whether you are happy or not. So we cannot get market data on that. So many researchers, they did survey, like questionnaire to ask about those questions. And the other way is rely to use big data. So I have a paper on the big data side. So that's basically the first paper I would like to discuss a little bit. This is already published, but just a way to show this broader social cost. We cannot only consider health, but we need to consider other dimensions. So this is a paper we published in Nature Human Behavior on air pollution and happiness. That's also used China data. So for this paper, we just use this social media data. So basically that's the Weibo, the Chinese Twitter data. So we collect all this geo-coded social media data from Weibo, and then they have location, and then we use this natural language processing skill, natural language processing technique, computer science. For every post, we use this to get a sentiment score, whether you are happy, whether you are unhappy, from 0 to 100. So that's some examples. And then we get this, then we aggregate into individual level and also city level. And our main unit of analysis in this paper is a city day level. For every day, for every city, we have a sentiment score aggregated from all these individuals' tweets on that specific day. So then we have this sentiment city day index, and then we merge in with all these variables, and then we do spatial econometrics model, and we study how air pollution measured by PM 2.5, particulate matters 2.5 on people's sentiment, and we have all the controls. So that's very straightforward econometric identification, and we find really even from this plot, scatter plot, you can see it's a negative correlation between the pollution and the people's happiness. And then we, of course, we run models, and we find one standard deviation increase in the pollution PM 2.5 concentration is associated with this March 0.043 standard deviation decrease in our Weibo happiness index. So, and of course, you will say, okay, of course, there's two major issues from the identification perspective. One is when it's very polluted, then people tend to tweet more about pollution. When it's blue sky, you focus on other interesting things. When it's so polluted, you just talk a lot about pollution and you complain a lot. So that might be just a drive, this correlation. So to address that, we drop all the tweets, like the weather-related tweets, like those examples. The weather-related tweets actually is not a big portion. It's like only like less than 2% of our total tweets. We drop all the weather-related, including pollution. And then we still run this regression. We still find a very negative impact, which means on polluted days, so not only you complain about pollution directly, but when you do other things, the happiness you can draw from other things also become lower. For example, you read a very interesting book and you watch a movie. That's nothing to do with specific pollution, but on a good day, on a bad day, then you watch a movie and you read an interesting book, but the happiness you can draw from that become lower. So that's a way we interpret our story. And we also found some heterogeneous effects. Then basically on weekends, on holidays, this impact become larger because people have plans to meet with their friends and to go to parks and the leisure activities, but then polluted. You have to cancel, you have to postpone. So that's basically people become less happy. And also female they suffer more from this pollution. So basically, maybe they care more about their family's health and they are more sensitive to pollution. So that's some heterogeneity. And we also run this and get city-specific elasticity. So for every city, we estimate a specific model to identify. And which city the people there, they are more sensitive. So we find actually of course, because this air pollution, is a major component of the quality of life. So then for the richer cities and people there, they care more. And also in very dirty cities and in very clean cities, they are more sensitive to air pollution. So that's like the city related, the city specific some heterogeneity. So that's the story to show that we really have a very broad social cost of air pollution. That's an example. And then we switch to, okay, people, the citizens, they are not passive victims. They take action, even if the government is not so effective in regulating, but people, they can still do something to protect themselves. So basically, they have different choices. They have many choices. As I just now said, air purifiers, face masks, and pharmaceutical purchases, like kind of medicine, if they really have some they are sick. And there are many papers on this, including our paper here in 2017 in ecological economics. So for this, for my paper, I didn't put slides on this, but if you're interested, so basically we in this paper, we told an inequality story. So our story was, of course, we still use China data. So that's an inequality, means, okay, yes, all the people can buy face masks, can buy air purifiers, but face masks are so cheap. And air purifiers is not cheap, thousands of RMB. And then, of course, the rich people have more capacity and affordability for these relatively expensive but very effective self-production products. So we use data to show actually the income inequality is exacerbated when we factor in this defensive expenditure, because rich people have more ways, they drive private cars, they live in better places because they can buy houses there, and they buy these expensive products, then they protect even much better. But poor people can only face mask or they work outside because they are blue collar workers. So the pollution exposure inequality will be exacerbated if we only rely on the market. And then also other papers look at non-market behaviors. For example, people stay at home, they don't go out, they cancel their travel, they don't go to parks. Of course, they breathe less dirty air, but there are this foregone opportunity cost because they lose all those opportunities. And also on the pollution, on the transportation side, when it's very clean, of course, we can encourage even some, of course, all the city government, they encourage people to use active commuting, to reduce driving, etc. On blue sky days, no problem. But on very dirty days, that's a problem, right? Because, I mean, people always need to consider their own health. So on polluted days, people might have the incentive to switch back to driving because they really want to be safe and protect themselves. So that's some mobility side evidence. So then based on those literature review and all our story line, we come up with a theoretical framework like this conceptual framework, like in this way. So basically, we have the pollution driver. Basically, that's a social cost because the producers, like factories and like the power plants and those, they emit pollution. They emit pollutants to the air. And then, of course, if we have very effective policy, we will mitigate. But if we don't have that, if this is social cost and the producers, they don't care, then they continue to emit. And then we'll have biological impacts on individuals, on the citizens. So that's the exposure. Then you have the impact. And then now here, the avoidance behavior enters the system, because then people start to take action, decentralized actions to act, to do things. Then this impact will be reduced. So then we only have a residual biophysical impacts, because then people all stay at home, wear face masks, etc. And then, but still have some residual impact, right? So then that will cause the reduction in the cause a problem for the health and the reduction in the welfare. And so basically the avoidance behavior, this channel will reduce the pollution exposure and thus reduce the health impact and the welfare loss. But the other channel, second channel, is that it itself also has cost. As I said, you need to buy. That's a defensive expenditure. That's not free. You need to spend money to buy. And also the foregone activity, that's opportunity cost. You lost all the things, all the activities, and also the social consequences. That's a social cost. So basically, for example, for the mobility example, people protect themselves, they drive more. And then when they drive more, they protect themselves, but at the same time, they emit more. It's kind of a vicious cycle. They emit more air, more pollutants to the air. So they become a producer themselves. Then that will induce more social cost. So that's kind of all the cost. Then when you calculate the overall total pollution damage, you need to consider the avoidance behaviors two channels. One is to reduce the damage, the others at new cost. Then you need to consider the overall. So that's basically these models, this conceptual. We're not gonna do this theoretical modeling, but they already, some papers provide such a framework, say, okay, so basically avoidance behavior will be a function, the health cost, this H is a health. The health cost is a function of pollution itself, and also an endogenous part, which is people's responsive behavior. So basically the pollution, objective pollution, and then people's behavior also as a function of the pollution itself. Then this behavior and the pollution itself will together determine the final impact on the health. And on the other hand, if the government, they understand this framework, when they design optimal environmental policy, basically that's a marginal cost should equal to the marginal benefit of that policy. Because if you want to regulate, if you want to invest in abatement equipment to reduce the pollution emission, then the government will invest a lot of money to clean up the air, which is this cost. The marginal cost of the government, the government decide, how much million I need to put to clean up the air. Then the additional money, additional dollar put into that action should equal to the additional benefit, marginal benefit from, if the air quantity increased by this much, and what's the benefit of that? So when you think about the benefit, you need to think entire picture. You have the health and the welfare, like the happiness, and you have the productivity gain because people become more productive. But at the same time, you need to understand, people are doing these avoidance behaviors, those are costs. You need to understand this. This is a big part here. If you neglect this, then you cannot get the optimal level of the environmental policy. So that's our main point, these things. Okay, so that's our framework. And then I have two working papers here to go through how we think about. One is this pollution and outdoor leisure. The other is mobility. So for the defensive expenditure, this first one, I already had my 2017 paper, this face mask and air purifier paper as an example. Then currently the two working papers are on the foregone activity opportunity cost and the social cost of the vicious cycle story. So the pollution and outdoor leisure paper is we use these parks, visitation of the parks. So we still use big data. we have a co-author of the computer science co-author. So we get this 10-cent location-based service. It's kind of mobile phone-based data to count how many people show up at a specific location. So we have such a rich big data set of all over China 2017. And also we have 10,000 parks, about 19 categories, all the parks. Later I will show you all kinds of these city parks and these national parks and all the small parks, big parks, and etc. All types. And then of course we have all these control variables. We have the pollution and the meteorological stations to provide the weather conditions. So that's basically our basic big data sets. So the idea, the rationale, the model also straightforward, and it's a fixed effect regression. And we have the park visitation. We have the for CTC on time t for park I. So that's sometimes we +1 because sometimes it's 0. So we want to make sense of this log function. So that's the basically this is a visitation. How many people show up in a park at that specific time? We do this daily, we do this hourly for that park. As a function of all those things, of course, our main interest is this PM 2.5 pollution, because that's our main story. But we do control for all the weather controls, as you know. And we have all these fixed effects, the day of week, city of by month, park fixed effect to account for all the unobserved unobserved attributes of the park of the day, etc. And of course, you know, this kind of study, we face endogeneity issue. Actually, that's also true for the happiness paper just now I introduced. And for that happiness paper and for this paper, we use the same idea to construct an instrumental variable for local air pollution. So basically, endogeneity is like in this way. if like we observe there's a correlation between parks and the PM 2.5, but we are not sure whether that's a causal impact or just a correlation. So we can tell other stories. For example, it's a holiday and many people just come out and they go to parks and drive to the parks. Then if they drive to parks, they emit more pollutants. And it's because it's so congested and the holiday, all people come out. And then you observe higher pollution and higher park visitation. That's also a correlation, but basically that's not the causal effect we are looking at. Our story is when, because of all other conditions, then the city becomes so polluted, so exogenous variation of the pollution, then people don't go to parks. So we want to rule out other channels, but we want to look at this exogenous pollution impact on people's park visitation. So we just do this instrumental variable using the wind. We leverage the near cities. So from the upwind cities, the pollutants in the upwind cities blown from the upwind cities to this city by the wind. So basically, if you are so unfortunate, your city is so unfortunate in the downwind direction of very dirty cities. Very dirty cities are on the top of you, upwind direction, and the wind just blow the pollutants from those dirty cities to your own city. That's an exogenous shock to your city. That's not the fault of your own city, but just basically you have bad neighbors. And then for this pollution, that's very exogenous. That has nothing to do with your own city's any activity or things or events. Then if you still observe from this exogenous imported pollution, then people react by not going to parks. Then we are more confident that's a causal effect. So that's basically the idea of the instrumental variable. So then we use this instrumental variable approach, and we started whether people are responsive to the pollution. And as you know, if you know the geography of China, basically for the north part, they're more in the winter, they're more polluted because of the winter heating. the south part relatively clean. And we do observe that this response is more like significant in the north part of China. You see, all these are very significant when it's higher pollution and people don't go out. You will find less people in those parts, but this is not the case for the southern cities, which are relatively clean. And actually, we find this is we also find like this impact even lack for more than 3 days. So even lack for more than 3 days. The first day, the effect is very big, but it's lack for 2 to 3 days. And then we find this dose response function is park visitation has a linear reduction trend with the pollution, and if we control for all other confounding factors. So basically, a heavily polluted, very big impact is almost linear. And if we do this by and cubic earth plan function is quite linear. And high-end park are more sensitive because high-end park, rich people go there, they care more. And tourist attractions not that sensitive, because anyway the tourists, they already went to the city, so they can only be there for a few days. So no matter the weather is what and pollution is what, they just go to those parks. And of course, the weekends and holidays, they're much more affected because people have more flexibility on those days and they have planned to go to parks, then they have to cancel. And we also did a rough estimate of the total cost because we want to have some like message to the policy makers. Not because we only look at one angle, it's just a park. It's one typical leisure activity. So we want to show, even if you consider just one type of the leisure activity, because there are so many leisure activities, but even if you only look at a park, if you estimate the potential benefit of reducing the heavily polluted days, then you will generate such a big benefit from that, because people really draw this utility from visiting parks. So there are, we cite other papers, parameters of this benefit per day, per person, per active day. That's from other literature. And then we know our own estimate reduction due to the pollution. So basically, polluted days, on heavily polluted days, the reduction to the park visitation is about almost 10%. So that's from this regression table. It's 10%, very highly polluted days. And then we calculate all the things, how many parks and how many hours people stay in the park, etc. Then we reach to this estimate. This is a big number. So basically, we know that China has this target, policy target, to reduce heavily polluted days by 4 days on average. Then if they really achieve that goal, then it's a benefit. So that's a way to show this is this cost you need to consider. If you consider this cost, then so basically your benefit of this pollution mitigation policy will become more, and you need to do this policy. Help the city officials to make their mind to do this policy because there's more benefit. Okay, so that's our working paper on the leader activity as an example of the foregone benefit. And the second working paper, or the third paper in my presentation, also we look at another type of this cost of avoidance behavior, which is the induced social cost. So the story, as I mentioned, is yes, people protect themselves, but kind of unconsciously they produce more pollution to the air by switch from active commuting, non-vehicle to vehicle driving. So why I want to also mention this paper, because I want to let you know, to show you that we have different ways of doing this kind of research. So for my happiness paper, That's like social media, big data, based on social media and big data, and like interdisciplinary with computer science, natural language processing. And my second part paper, also like big data, mobile phone positioning data, and also work with computer science people, co-authors on that. And for this paper, we did experiment, RCT, to better identify the treatment effect. So that's a research approach, different research methodologies. So basically the motivation of this paper, I don't need to repeat, but basically pollution is very bad, and basically it's a dilemma. So it's a dilemma in the health sense in terms of active commuting. So basically air pollution and the lack of physical activity are two leading causes of the death. So from the this chart of the global burden of diseases, you can see basically pollution is a major cause. And however, if you just you high blood pressure and all the things, all the diseases, that's a lack of physical activity. So they both will cause a problem for the health. But so active commuting, biking, and walking, etc., they are good for your health because there's active physical activity. But if you do that in a very polluted day, then you have another problem. The flip side is pollution exposure. So it's kind of dilemma, right? You want to promote active commuting, but you don't want to promote those active commuting in polluted days. But in developing countries, active commuting in such a effective way, you cannot just consider one side, you need to consider both sides. So that's the motivation. So that's so basically, and another thing is because thanks to the IoT, the low cost sensor and all the technology, and more ways to inform citizens about this ambient air pollution, not the city level, but it's very nearby, your local level, even some sensor in your cell phone or some wearable devices that can tell you your customized, tailored pollution exposure. So basically, if you tell people, that's important, you need to let people know. You need to inform them of your ambient nearby pollution, and then that will trigger this self-protection incentives, because people just, oh, every day I say, oh, my exposure, air pollution exposure is how much. Then they will become more consensus and cautious and be sensitive to the pollution. Then they will take action. If they don't know, or they only know the city level, or they even don't know the city level, then they couldn't think about this. But if you give them all this tailored information, then they start to think, they start to act. And what are the social impacts of that? So then we go to a Chinese city. We go to a Chinese city to do experiment. And this is a northern Chinese city with very high pollution in the winter time, but relatively okay pollution level in other seasons. And then we really went there. We have big team. We had like 10 people, 10 to 15 researchers. We went to that city last summer from MIT. And then we recruit local college students, like a class. I couldn't remember the number, but like 50 to 60 students together. So we have like such a big team to do this experiment. And we recruited these 2,200 non-vehicle commuters, like the bike, like bus and the subway, public transit, and electric bike, etc. Walk around that CBD of that city. And we recruit them and we did a survey. So because we were only there for the summer, So we did a survey, but in the spirit of the RCT, randomized controlled trial design. We have the treatment group, we have the control group randomly assigned. And then we have the two treatment, because we want to understand the dilemma just now I mentioned. And then basically the idea is like this. So we went there in the summer, as you know, in the summer, our city was not so dirty. It's kind of here. And then the baseline choice is the real clean day, because in the summer, relatively clean. And then we give the treatment group a health nudge. A health nudge, but later I will show you, we use the iPad, we develop an app, and we show that if you do your active commuting, and what's the health benefit for yourself because you do exercise, all the benefit, it's a health nudge. Then we observe how they will switch to active commuting. Remember, we have 2,000 non-vehicle commuters in our sample, but only 20% are active commuters in terms of bike and walking. Otherwise, they take other people, they still, like, they are non-vehicle, but they are taking bus, they are taking subway or electric bike, etc. So we will say, if we tell them the health benefit of active commuting, whether many more people will choose that. So that's a clean day scenario. And then we switch to a polluted day scenario, because in reality it's clean. So we need to change their mindset. So we just show them a picture of the polluted day to like assume today or tomorrow is a kind of this polluted day, and we use picture of the same city around this neighborhood and from the winter time maybe. So basically they are familiar, they are very familiar with their own city, so they understand this scenario. Then we go to the polluted scenario, we got their baseline first, and then we give them the treatment tool with this air pollution, tailored air pollution exposure. Then we ask those questions again to say if this pollution day and whether their behavior will change. So that's our RCT design. So we have the control group and we have two treatment groups. For the control group, basically, we give them irrelevant information. We still give them information, but it's irrelevant to the real treatment. And then we have a treatment group 1, we only give them pollution exposure information, and the treatment group 2, we have the health and also the exposure, pollution exposure information. So then we can compare this treatment group to the control group to identify the treatment effect. As I said, we have a big team there, and we have some like environmental scientists together with us. And we really use these sensors, and we set the students to different transportation modes and measure. During the peak hours, the students went to all the modes on the same routes to measure the real ambient air pollution level. Because we want to give these respondents the real tailored information. And then we develop an app here, like that, on the iPad. And then we recruit local college students to do all these interviews with all the people there. And then from the app, we first ask, where do you live? Where do you work? Then we just use the map, this digital map, to calculate the real commuting time based on the congestion level. Then we have the student team to gather this pollution exposure information, ambient PM 2.5. Then we calculate the time from each individual's real work and we calculate. Then we multiply by all the factor, inhalation and pollution factors. Then we translate that to cigarettes equivalent, because common people, they have no idea about this environmental science, PM 2.5, microgram cubic meter, those measures, they have no idea. But when we translate to how many cigarettes you smoke, equivalent if you use this travel mode from home to work for a month, it's 5 cigarettes, 20 cigarettes, they suddenly understand how bad that mode for their house. So then we collect all the data, and I will just show you some results. So basically, the result is people intend to switch to the vehicle, no matter it's drive by themselves or take taxi or Chinese Uber, Didi on polluted days to protect themselves. So basically, you can see when on very polluted days, fully aware of the pollution exposure, when we show them in this, based on all the information, I will show you if you do this, that is how many cigarettes. If you do this, is how many cigarettes, like that. If you're driving, then the driving tendency will just increase a lot if we show them this exposure, and the active commuting tendency will drop a lot. So basically, the vehicle users will increase by 15% among all those initial non-vehicle commuters. This just will switch to driving. So basically, you can see actually people, they don't have enough knowledge. At first, we only show them a picture of the pollution day, a polluted day as picture. Then they do switch. They reduce active, they reduce electric bike, but they increase car, taxi, that's expected. But they also increase public transit, because at first they thought the bus and subway are relatively clean. Although polluted, but if I take bus, if I take subway, that's okay. So they switch to this. But after I will show them the real exposure data, then they say that the bus and the subway, they are also at relatively high pollution if the overall is so polluted. But all the people just switch to the private vehicle, car or taxi. So that means the tailored information really help educate them the real pollution level exposure. And another interesting is we found a science article. This one is from another paper, not our paper. We found a science article about this break-even point. The idea is this active commuting. So if like it's polluted days, this is a PM 2.5 level. So what's the break even in terms of the benefit and the cost to your house? If it's polluted, but you only like commute not so long, not so many minutes, that's still good for your house, because this active commuting exercise benefit outweigh the exposure cost. But if you like commute such a long time, you buy such a long time, then gradually the house cost will increase faster than the benefit, and then the break-even point is how many minutes. Then basically, if you buy for longer than that, the cost will outweigh the benefit. So you should not, if you are rational. So then from this literature, we find, okay, break-even point at this level of this, we told these respondents, this scenario is 30 minutes per one-way trip. That's a break-even. So longer than 30 minutes, you should not do. Smaller than this, shorter than this, still okay. Still okay. This exercise benefit is still big. But from the reality, from the survey data, actually, we found people reduce active commuting even when their biking time is shorter than this break-even point that we cited from the science literature. So we feel like people are risk averse. So they are not, when they're polluted, when they understand the cost of the house cost, they become very conservative. No matter how long they commute, they just switch. That's consistent with the information we got from a survey that so they understand the air quality in the city in the winter is so terrible. So that's some questions in our survey. So they understand this. And then because we also have the exercise nudge, and then we found that it is effective on a blue sky day. If we tell, okay, we will give you some small money, we mimic this subsidy policy. Say, if you choose this active commuting, we will give you some small subsidy, and then to nudge you to choose. And that works well in a clean day. but this effect relatively is gone on polluted days, no matter whether we give them subsidy, whether we educate them, that's good. But that's basically, they are more and more reluctant just to lose the effect, or they ask for a lot of money to still keep on the non-vehicle choice. So that's basically the story like this. So basically, that's basically impose a challenge for the policymakers. Say, if the city overall in general is so dirty, it's very hard for the policymakers to do the nudge to encourage people to stay in the non-vehicle choice and even the active commuting, no matter whether you educate them or you give them money as an incentive. It's very hard. And also you need to question yourselves whether you should do so, because you need to consider the health of your citizens. So that's, you need to balance all those goals. So that's all my presentation. So very quick conclusion as a summary. So basically we started avoidance behaviors, and we know that avoidance behaviors on the one hand will reduce the pollution exposure and reduce the negative impact on the health. On the other hand, will also incur some new costs, carry non-market costs. Basically, we started opportunity cost using park visitation as an example, and we started the social cost using the commuting as another example. Then we draw some policy implications that information is good, but it's also will induce some other like behaviors. And when you do cost analysis, cost benefit analysis of this regulation, you need to consider this induced non-market avoidance cost and etc. And of course, we have a lot of limitations. We only consider the park as one type. And we did a very rough estimation of the monetary estimation, this $1 million. And we for the RCT, we only did a survey. It's a stated preference, not a revealed preference. We just asked, and they said so, but we couldn't really track whether they do so. So that's a limitation. And also, we only look at this short run avoidance behaviors instead of long run. You can just leave that city at all. You can migrate to other clean cities. So that's my presentation, and I will stop here, and I look forward to your question and our discussion.
Thank you so much, Siqi. That was really wonderful. And I think that many of our students, myself included, really appreciate when you're able to break down what for less quantitatively oriented people is a very complex situation, even just reading a single paper, but then also telling that story in an easy to understand way, and then making the larger story across the many different papers to create such a comprehensive arc of those different connections and relationships. Really, really well done. So there has been a very active chat and lots of great questions here, and I think that Yichun has done a great job of answering some of the more methodological questions of clarification. There were questions about how do you understand wind direction, and do you account for how people in the north don't go out when it's cold. And so I think that it's clear that you guys did a good job of accounting for various variables in order to control for those different effects. And I think that each one you're probably still working on answering some of those questions. And then there are a set of questions that more are about the methodology in general, about qualitative versus quantitative. And so I think that I will let Nick ask his questions about the kinds of data. And I think that Brian, you also had a paired similar question in terms of the qualitative versus quantitative. So I'll get you guys to ask your questions in person. Again, I would invite everyone, now that we're entering the discussion period, to turn on your videos so that we feel like we're actually somewhat in the same room with each other. All right, Nick.
Thanks so much. And thanks again for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. And I just want to sort of echo sort of 2 points that I think this is like a great example of sort of weaving different research papers together into a coherent narrative that sort of speaks to a broader research agenda, and I really like that. And then also I just commend you for distilling complex methodological work in really accessible ways. So one of the questions I had that I've seen in your work and is just sort of about the trade-offs between using these different data sources, right? I see a lot of research papers that use big data, whether it's cell phone data or Twitter or Weibo data. And then sort of you did a really great part with the last paper of sort of pivoting to a totally different type of research. And so I would love to hear you reflect on the advantages and disadvantages of these different approaches and sort of what they allow you to do for people who are PhD students in the audience, and then sort of for your own work going forward, how you see these fitting together, what kinds of things each approach allows you to do or doesn't. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Brian, before Siqi answers, you have a somewhat similar question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It was really, really interesting. And so I'm working on a paper that was looking at some of the text things and kind of considering like sentiment analysis versus qualitative analysis and all of those things. So I was just wondering if, and one of the reasons that, well, other than like sample size, is that we decided to go with qualitative for mine was that it can get a little bit more nuanced than sentiment analysis, I feel like, because sentiment analysis a lot of times, at least from what I've read, is like happy, neutral, like positive, neutral, negative. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and whether there was any kind of plans to like kind of do a more nuanced analysis or like more, I don't know if that's the right way to frame it, like go deeper kind of than the sentiment analysis in a qualitative way of the social media posts.
Okay, both are very great questions. So I will answer in this way for the quantitative, and the methodology choice for the quantitative, the big data versus experiment. So that's related. It's a very good question, and I can link to my own research trajectory even beyond this specific topic. Because I know there are many PhD students here, maybe that might be helpful for their research design. And actually, as you know, that when I started my research back to like 2005 after I graduated, so at that time there was no very good big data sets, and there was no like this social media things, and also I didn't know anything about the experiment, and at that time I rely on small data sets. I think that's kind of small data sets and with limited access. For example, housing price, and I got some like from the local housing authority, because at that time we couldn't get like online this scraping technology. So then I relied on the small data sets to do the basic econometrics to do this identification. And then gradually, this more and more available of these big data sets. I got so excited about the big data sets, and because that's not just the sample size, but it's give you more opportunity for better, cleaner identification. And of course, there are limitations for those social media data sets because, for example, Weibo, you don't have a rich like social economic attributes of the individuals. You don't know their real like they self-reported some attributes, but this just self-reported, and you don't know their income, don't know their occupation, you don't know all those things. So that's a limitation, and also always we cannot argue the social media data represent the entire population because only those who are very active online, so you collect the data. But anyway, the big data, I feel like provide a lot of possibility to enhance the urban research, or we now call it urban science. And some data sets are better than others. For example, the mobile phone data should be better than Weibo data if we really count how many people show up here and there. For example, when I did my restaurant papers, I use Chinese Yelp. It's like a Dianping data. And then I always encounter the problem because now we cannot assume there's a constant proportion of people who go to restaurant who also register, who also check in social media. We cannot say, and we don't know. So and always need to make the assumption like that, and will be criticized by the referees. So there are upsides and downsides in the big data, but why I chose big data, because at least I have more data and I can do more identification and I can tell more story. But, and later, especially after when I was in China, I always did these observational studies, either small data set or big data sets, but observational. I did some small surveys, but it's kind of hundreds of thousands of questionnaires. And then later I got interested in this experiment, because for the observational studies, it's very hard. Although we can do natural experiment and quasi experiment, but it's very hard sometimes to really do a very, very, very clean identification. And sometimes it's constrained by the data. Then I got interested in the experiment, because in an experiment, this RCT, you can really have the treatment and control. You can design from scratch. You don't rely on others. You design from scratch and you do this RCT, like my last paper. But my last paper is not like 100% the ideal RCT, because we only did a survey. Actually, we plan to do a real one, and we plan to go back to that city and really track their real commuting behavior, but it was suspended because of the COVID. But maybe later we still will do that. And then I tried this because I feel like it's some opportunity for me to do this experiment and fully control the design. And another byproduct is I can make some real impact on the ground. I think that's also important for the urban planning discipline. We are not going just to publish. We want to have some real thing, impact on the ground. And to do the experiment, I have a team. I need to talk to the local officials. I need to get their support. Otherwise, I couldn't do. And I need to convince my research is important for them. And so that later when I have my paper published or report, then they really take it seriously, so that I can make something happen there. So that's another consideration. So that's basically my trajectory of the data and the quantitative research in this way. For the sentiment question, you are very right. For this sentiment measure I used in my first paper, it was kind of just like from 0 to 100 to measure from the very unhappy to happy. And then after that, we moved forward. And with this computer scientists' help, then we have actually we are now moving towards the multi-dimensional measure using the social media, not just the happiness, but all kinds of sentiment as anxious, depressed, upset. They have ways to measure not just the happiness itself. Okay, if you want to say something. And
I can answer that part about the multiple sentiments.
Multiple sentiment, especially when we are now doing the COVID, we want to study how the lockdown might lead to some depression. So that's kind of things we want to measure. And we also are doing topic analysis, but each one you can see more.
Yeah, currently the thing we have done, the sentiment analysis are more dictionary based, like LIWC or BIRDS, they're more like either dictionary based or like just negative or positive to dimension. And currently the computer science in our teams, computer scientists develop an algorithm which is based on neural network and some deep learning strategies. So it can allow us to distinguish anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, so have richer dimension. And we are currently working on using this kind of sentiment to detect fear and see how people behave during the COVID will differ by their subjective perception. And another thing is, as Siqi said, we are working intensively on the topic analysis and currently use that to study face mask querying and face mask perception. This is a thing we are currently ongoing, and we are thinking that if we can get this two technology more settled, we can actually apply it to broader context to support richer analysis rather than just positive or negative.
Wonderful, thank you. We have some more questions related to the equity dimensions. And I think this is an issue that you had started on talking about how being at MIT has elevated some of these concerns. So Natani, you had a question here about class.
Yeah,
And
I
yeah,
did.
okay, do
Sorry.
you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry I can't turn my video on right now. We have some inclement, so my connection's a little bit unstable. But I was just curious about how within, like, maybe looking in a city, how class divides and how climate change can impact, you know, different classes differently, how that relates to subjective well-being. And I know that you looked at the city more in a broader sense. So if there are considerations of within the city, the divide.
So, and I wanted to add to that, and I saw that Yichen, you said because sometimes with the Weibo data you don't have access to the socioeconomic indicators, you can't really tie who's making these responses. But I think that from other parts of the literature, there's a lot of concern about the willingness to pay and the willingness to the pay to pollute principles that undergird some of the analysis that if there is a kind of pollution and a certain social cost, then we can pay or have either require the polluters to pay certain amounts of penalties in order to do their run their industries the way they do, which may lead to incentives to reduce or perhaps may not. And then on the other hand, that if there's an assumption on the part of the respondents that they're able to switch to other modes, the assumption is that they have another mode that they can actually afford, or that they have access to a car, and certain people may not, or certain, there might even be class divides in terms of the activism on Weibo or other forms of social media. So thinking through all those, like how do you account for some of those impacts in your research?
Yes, that's also very good questions in terms of the social inequality. So basically, for the big data, one limitation, as you said, is very hard to draw their real social economic indicators of the population groups. But we always try to inform. We try to inform their social classes. So, for example, in my face mask and air purifier paper, I used the Taobao data, which is the Chinese Amazon data, which is the online purchases of the face masks and air purifiers by city, and very detailed data by day. And for that one, we use an approach that, because from at that time, Taobao opened the data to us, our research team, for this overall expenditure on Taobao. So like monthly expanding on Taobao, each individual on different categories, on different types of the products categories. Then we use that expenditure as a way to infer their income. Basically, of course, we have assumption that rich people will buy more and will buy more expensive luxury items. Instead, the poor people will buy less and buy necessary items. So we use the expenditure to infer their income class. That's why we could divide these people into high income, medium income, low income. And then we observe that basically this affordability constraint of the low income people became like exacerbate this inequality in the air pollution exposure, because they couldn't they couldn't buy those expensive products to protect better. And that's basically for this that paper. And later we also have other papers on real estate. On the real estate paper, we argue that we can identify that rich households, that they have a higher willingness to pay for cleaner places, in terms of the cleaner cities or cleaner locations within a city, because they have a higher willingness to pay. If we only rely on market, they will beat out these median income and low income households. So then the median and low income household, they couldn't afford, and then they have to go to the less desirable places in terms of the environmental quality. That as another story, like a spatial story, that show this exacerbated in social inequality due to the market. So then we for the paper we present today, each one can add, but we also have the argument for the commuting, as Linda, you said. Yes, so for some people they have the ability to switch, but for other people they don't have the ability to switch. They cannot afford like everyday vehicle mode. So that's another implication. So, and overall, we drew this policy implication like in this way. Avoidance behaviors are important, and we cannot assume people are just passive victims. Avoidance behavior, which also has upside and downside. Upside is even if the government in the short run, they have other objectives, especially for the developing countries, the government might have like economic growth is their priority, etc. So they don't put much emphasis in the pollution mitigation. And then the upside is individuals. If we have a real market, a well-functioning market, individuals have the way, at least, to protect themselves. But the downside will be the social inequality will be exacerbated because the poor people always have less ability to adjust. So that's the downside. So our implication is we really need public policy. If public policy to clean up the air, if the public policy to address climate change, everyone will benefit, no matter what, because we breathe the same air when we walk outside, no matter whether you're a billionaire or you are a poor household or is a disadvantaged group. So the public policy is so important in this sense. So that's my response to this way of starting. So Yichun, do you want to add something?
Oh, yes, I was just typing in the chat. I can just directly say, so in the survey analysis, we also did some heterogeneity analysis and indeed found that people who own a car have this alternative, had much higher and stronger intention to reduce active commuting and increase driving, which just really what Siqi just mentioned, which kind of increased people's voluntary avoidance behavior, kind of increased the disparities between the socioeconomic groups.
Yes, so I also want to say that if beyond this avoidance behavior studies, our group also started this environmental justice. I think that's very relevant to this topic of this social inequality. So we started the environmental justice in terms of in China. We started because China is in the transition, in the dynamic transition, that the coastal area, richer area, they become richer and they upgrade their industries. So they currently they don't like the dirty farms because they don't need them. They upgrade their industry to high tech, which are relatively clean. And then they just push out these dirty farms by all the means. For example, lift the land price and higher tax on all the things. And these dirty farms, they need to leave those cities, but the poor areas in the hinterland and the poor places, they still want those farms, those dirty farms, because they still need the GDP. So that's a domestic pollution haven. And we started how the dirty farms migrate from relatively clean places to migrate from relatively richer places to the hinterland poor places and continue to emit pollutants. But the poor places, they really need the jobs and really need GDP. So they have a higher tolerance for that. That's basically the environmental Kuznets curve story. So that's kind of how the trade-off between economic growth and the pollution. That's a story in my book. And I really sent students to some, because I have my friends. So I have my old classmates, they are now mayors of rich cities and poor cities. And I sent students to interview those mayors, and I got real stories from what's on their mindset. What's the mindset for the rich region, poor region in terms of the polluting forms and their action and how these citizens they are feeling. So that's another environmental justice story.
So I'm really glad that you raised the spatial issue because we have another question here from Braden. Braden, do you want to ask a question directly? It's kind of tied to how so Siqi just talked about the movement of the firms out of the rich cities into lower income cities. And I think at the same time, there's been a hukou shift. So your question is about hukou. And I think that there's a relationship of maybe you could say like a double injustice. It's not just only the firms are moving, but the people are moving. So there's a double movement of where they're going. Braden, are you still here?
Yeah. Sorry, my bandwidth is not the greatest, so I'm keeping my video off. But yeah, my question is related to the book Blue Skies Over Beijing, which I'm reading in John's class right now. You talked about the hukou system kind of directing migrants towards the smaller and medium-sized cities. I'm curious how effective that system has been since you wrote that book, and how maybe has that directed the flow of migrants towards like balancing economic growth and environmental and social well-being.
Good question. So I think the hukou system has not changed that much since I wrote that book, but it did change a lot from 1980s to 1990s and 2000. So basically, at first, the hukou system was very rigid, and basically, they just constrain the entire mobility of people. So you couldn't go to other cities if you didn't have the hukou of that city. But later, after the economic reform, the government understood that the labor market mobility is so important. And if you want economic growth, you need to let people move, especially as labor, just as labor, because those cities, they really needed labor to produce, especially cheap labor, which correspond to the rural migrants. They are cheap labor. So they relaxed the hukou system with this consideration of allow cheap labor to move into the cities, so that the factories in the cities, they could have enough enough cheap labor to produce products and can be sold to the global market. That's China's initial economic growth story of the cheap labor and the global market-driven, export-driven economic growth model. That's why they relaxed the hukou. So people could move. For example, rural people, the farmers, they could enter the city and became workers in all those factories. But however, the problem here is related to the social welfare perspective. Is for the cities, they only wanted to use those rural migrants as a labor, cheap labor, and they didn't care about their welfare at all. So they relaxed the hukou in terms of the labor mobility, but they didn't relax the hukou in terms of the access to the local public services. So those rural migrants enter the city, they stay in the informal housing sector because they couldn't afford this very, very expensive housing. They couldn't afford the very expensive housing, and they were not eligible for this housing subsidy, public housing, etc. So they had to stay in the informal housing sector, very cheap, and they had no access to the school, public health, medical service, etc. And they earn very little salary from the factories. So basically that's a hukou. And till now, it's still, I think there's still a situation. But later, some interesting story was some cities, especially on the coastal and also rich, and then some cities they upgraded to the high skill, and they even didn't need the cheap labor at all. So they just found ways to let those low skill migrants go. And other cities, they still like very manufacturing sector based. They need more and more, and they relax a little bit, and they even provide some like public service to those rural migrants workers. So that's some like different stories going on different places, just depending on whether the cities really needs labor. So the key thing is the city government, they manipulate the hukou system in their interest, whether they need the cheap labor or they really need this cheap labor to stay in their cities for a long time. If they want them to stay long, they will provide service. If they just need them for when they are in their 30s, 40s, then they don't need them. Then they only use their labor instead without providing service. They still like discriminate against those migrants and using hukou as a tool. I'm not sure whether I answered your question in terms of the hukou.
That's very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, and also for like college graduates, all the cities like them because college graduates for the high skill, so easier for them to get hukou.
So Siqi, I guess to build on that question, as I noted, I've been doing research on the sector of water, where recently across a series of case studies that we did, the story that we were finding is that when you think about water, there's a whole chain that happens, and it's not only about what happens in a particular site or a particular sector of water, but when you look at the arc of the entire story, one that you might see across water supply and floodwater management in the cities we were looking at were in India and South Asia and Southeast Asia. So if you look at where water supply begins, it begins in rural areas. So you extract rural water so that farming in rural areas becomes impossible in some cases. You extract this water, it goes into cities, and the rural workers have to migrate into cities in search of work, but also because they've been dispossessed of rural agricultural. Go into cities where, as you say, oftentimes, whether it's in China or elsewhere, there's no affordable housing, there's not necessarily access to water. They're living in informal settlements, and in the global south, that's often even worse than informal settlements. In China, there's not even access to water. They have to pay more to get bottled water or trucked in water. And then because they're in informal conditions, if there is a flood, the desire to remove people from places in order to make way for water or to make way for water projects is to remove them out of a city into other places. And then outside of the city, because if a city wants to protect itself, it builds a seawall, it builds a dike, it diverts water into the back into the peri-urban areas or to rural areas to flood those areas rather than for cities. I'm just wondering, as you talk about the kind of migration and hukou and movement of people and industries, do you see that same kind of injustice story happening where these richer cities, as they develop, they no longer want these polluting industries, but neither do they want the low-income people that go with those industries. And so these industries that are still necessary to the national GDP and product development, and those migrant poor become shifted across the landscape in different sites. And so those cities, once they develop, the city is still not for the rural poor. It's still for those who are originally from there or have gained access to education.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think there's very rich political economy embodied in this, as you said, the chain, either the water pollution or air pollution or other like pollution. I think that's basically a political economy. Then we can tell a very rich story, but based on the specific context. So for the water pollution, I don't have my own research on water pollution, but I feel like your story is quite convincing, and maybe I can. So for the chain as you described, one thing is yes. One thing maybe you can add into your chain, your big picture, is yes, the urban sector extract water from the rural, and the rural people enter the city and to produce, but with a very bad pay in the informal sector. And then the urban sector produce manufacturing. They are manufacturing sector. They produce, then they emit pollutants into the water. And the water is like the rivers are linked. So the pollutants in the water will flow to all the places, including other rural areas, and contaminate the farming. So I saw some media story of that. The big cities, the dirty factories, like the chemistry like that, then they pollute the water, and the water flow to other places, the rural places. And then the rural farmers who are still farming there, and the land become contaminated and the crops. And then becomes the global market of the products, of the agricultural products. And those contaminated agricultural products then was sold to all places and to the cities. and to even to other countries. So that's another side of the story. Maybe you can also start.
Thanks so much, Siqi. We have another question about the kind of regional dynamics here from Edward. Edward, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. I apologize. My internet has been kind of shaky this morning. I apologize for the video. But first, thank you very much for the informative presentation. I've been reading your book, and it's also really, really informative on the whole situation. My question is just that in the book, you mentioned that there are certain, as you just said, actually, there are certain externalities associated with pollution from a regional level, as in factories can pollute locally, but it will have regional consequences. So in your opinion, how might policymakers at a broader level, at a national level, maybe in particular to the Chinese situation, kind of address this issue and balance this pollution on a regional level?
Yes, that's also a very good question. It's not just like a national level. I mean, perhaps also international level. Because as you know that Japan and South Korea, they also suffer a lot from the yellow dust blew there by wind from China. And they suffer a lot, they complain a lot. So I think that's regional and even international collaboration. So here, my argument like in this way, this also applies to both air pollution and water pollution. So the basic point is the air and water pollution, they don't respect this administrative boundary or political boundary. They don't respect. Basically, the air pollution, the wind will blow, and water pollution, the water will flow. So they don't, as a natural phenomenon, they don't respect the administrative boundary. So always you will observe these cross-boundary externalities, as I mentioned. And for researchers, sometimes we take advantage of that to build our instrumental variables. But for the policymakers and for the people, for the citizens, so basically, I argue we need a regional or international collaboration mechanism. So one example, I still want to use two examples, two opposite examples I observed in China to tell the story. So as you know, Hong Kong is surrounded by Guangdong province. And the Guangdong province, back to 1980s, 1990s, was very heavy manufacturing sectors at the Guangdong. I think now it's also the situation. But Hong Kong is a service economy. But Hong Kong is surrounded by Guangdong. And Hong Kong suffered a lot by these pollutants blow from Guangdong to Hong Kong. And then Guangdong and Hong Kong, they sit together at the table to negotiate. Of course, from the researcher's point of view, we can calculate even. We can measure how big these cross-boundary pollutants are. And from my research, I can even calculate because of pollutants, then how the real estate price will go down in Hong Kong because of the pollutants. Then we can calculate some monetary value as a loss of Hong Kong because of the Guangdong pollutants. Then they two, this is a real story. They two sat together at the table, they negotiate, and Hong Kong was willing to subsidize, was willing to pay some money to subsidize Guangdong, these manufacturing firms to install some abatement equipment and to clean up the pollutants. So Hong Kong subsidized Guangdong in terms of money and also knowledge, know-how, and technology things. Then Guangdong benefited. Guangdong got money, got the expertise, and then regulate and reduce the pollution. And Hong Kong also benefit. So they negotiated the exact terms and amount. That's kind of some for the researchers, and they can calculate, they can support. But the basic idea, they negotiate, and it's a win-win situation. And another example is like Beijing and nearby. So Beijing and nearby, Beijing, capital city of China, was surrounded by very poor province, Hebei province. And Beijing is a capital city. It's also a service and a political center, and not so many polluting firms. And the Hebei province is so poor, they still rely on manufacturing a lot and power plants. And then the winter then the wind will just blow the pollutants from Hebei to Beijing. But because Beijing is such a high political status, and the Beijing government, they look down at all nearby, like the town and the other medium and small size city governments. And they didn't sit down together, but Beijing just used their political power to ask, say, you must reduce this pollution by that much. Otherwise, Beijing, all the central government, all these political top leaders, they care so much about Beijing, and the Beijing pollution also important for the international reputation of the whole China. So they just use political to ask them to mandate, like, you must close down the factories, you must close the winter heating if you rely on coal. Yes, that also was effective because it's like political power top down. But problem is, again, the social inequality issue. Because then the Hebei province, all the poor places, the workers lost their jobs because factories were closed down. And then in the winter, they had to close the winter heating, but they couldn't find other natural gas-based heating. Then all the poor people, household, they had very cold, freezing homes because they had no winter heating. They were not allowed to run the winter heating. But they didn't have any other option. But for Beijing, they have no problem because they have natural gas. They have other ways for the winter heating. Then that reduced that led to a big problem of social inequality justice issue. So that's two examples: market-based negotiation, collaboration, and this political power-based kind of another way, and totally led to different outcomes. So that's two examples. And I know there was some like a collaboration between China, South Korea, and Japan. They talk about this regional thing, air pollution thing. I think that's another international examples.
Thanks so much. While we're on this topic, Nidhi, you had asked a question. Do you feel that Siqi's answer just now has answered it, or do you want to elaborate on your question?
No, I think she kind of touched upon it, but I mean, I'm curious to see if there'd be more attempts at creating transboundary air pollution management governance systems, because Nepal suffers from air pollution in India every winter. And, you know, Nepal is a poor country. India is a dominant force in the subcontinent. And so there's all those inequalities, but there needs to be some broader cooperation around this.
Right, I agree. And for the water pollution, I know there are examples of this regional collaboration. I always think this regional collaboration is important just because of the cross-boundary issue.
All right, we have a question from Zheng about spatial structure and the relationship to a lot of these different issues. Zheng, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Siqi, for this very informative presentation. So my research interest is how the urban spatial structure can affect the air quality, for example, the polycentric urban system. Because based on the theory, the polycentric system can limit the urban agglomeration diseconomics, like the congestion and the air pollution, but at the same time, the urban system can still benefit from the agglomeration economics. So I wonder, have you ever considered how these urban spatial structure effects can affect the air quality? For example, polycentric can improve the housing, the job housing balancing, because some people probably move to the sub-centers to locate to nearby their employment places. Yeah, some discussion like that. Thanks.
Okay, good. That's a very promising research direction. So you are a PhD student or you're a master student?
I'm a PhD student.
Yes, that's good, because it's a very promising direction, I feel. So basically, fundamentally, this idea, so what you mentioned is the economies of scale versus diseconomies of scale, this trade-off when we study urban spatial structure. So there's a theory of the optimal city size, and also we can also, it's optimal city size, basically city growth. Then you have the agglomeration benefits, but you also have this diseconomies like congestion cost. So the optimal city size will hint on the trade-off between these two, the agglomeration benefits and the congestion cost. The congestion cost here, not just traffic congestion, but also the air pollution, all those things you mentioned. So the city will be at the optimal size when the manageable cost and manageable benefit equals each other. So that's a theoretical part, the thinking tool, the thinking way. So you can apply that to the monocentric city model. So I think basically the idea rationale is the monocentric city. If the city center continues to grow, then of course the benefit will grow, but the cost will also grow. At some type tipping point, the cost will go beyond the benefit, and then you will have the optimal size of this one center. And after that, then a subcenter will emerge. So I think that's a basic rationale. But basically, if we only rely on market force, then we cannot internalize this congestion cost because the forms only consider agglomeration without considering other costs by cluster too much together. So I think that's basically you need some like way to internalize those costs like pollution and congestion in the way to so that when form choose whether to when the additional form choose to locate in the original center or go to another place to set up a new center, the firm can consider this congestion cost. For example, charge congestion fee or charge this pollution related tax, etc. So I think that's a rationale of this theoretical model. But empirically, the huge literature on the urban spatial structure and environment, basically land use, transportation, and the environment. As you said, it's like related to the jobs housing balance and the sub-center polycentric structure, and also to like public transit, whether you have a big city, but you have very good public, so that also a way to reduce pollution. So I have some papers on that, basically to see whether the new subway line will encourage people to switch from driving to taking subway, and thus will really reduce pollution, etc. around the subway station. So that's something if you are interested. And Yichun here also, and me, we have a paper on this shared bikes. So how the shared bikes can also further between the shared bikes and the subway, and people ride a bike last mile and then take subway, and then more discouraged to drive, and then to reduce air pollution. So that's all kinds of research ideas, but basically it's a lot in the urban spatial structure and air pollution.
Thank you so much, Professor Siqi.
All right, we have time for one last question. I'm going to take the opportunity to call on John here.
Thanks, Linda. Well, first, Siqi, I just really want to thank you for the wonderful presentation and the really thoughtful answers that you've given. And it's been a really rich discussion this morning. The question I have is mainly just out of curiosity. In the United States, agencies like the EPA have adopted, the value of a statistical life, which in the United States has been estimated, around, I guess, $11 to $12 million for a statistical life. Of course, for those of you listening that have never heard this term before, the value of an individual life is priceless. If we're talking about my life or Linda's life, it's priceless. But there's another concept of a statistical life. And so, Siqi, I was just curious if that concept has been adopted in China at all, or if it's and if so, if there's been attempts to estimate it in the Chinese context.
Yeah, I think so. I think there are are some researchers are doing this similar research to quantify this value of statistic life. And I remember there was a report, I couldn't remember exact number, but there was a report made, several years ago by the World Bank and plus some Chinese researchers. They quantified the loss due to the air pollution. They calculated, oh, the total loss of the air pollution is like I remember like 3 to 5% of GDP. And when they calculate that number, they use this VSL as a parameter to translate the deaths due to the air pollution to the monetary value. But I couldn't remember the numbers of that, but they are doing so.
Great, thank you.
Any other final questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Siqi. Let's all unmute and give Siqi a big round of applause and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Yichun, thank you also.
Thank you. And so happy to be here and keep in touch.
Definitely.
Thank
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.